A 5-year-old boy stood in the courtroom, his small hand trembling as he pointed straight at a respected police officer. "I saw him there that night." The entire room fell silent. How could a child dare to accuse a man in power? And if he was telling the truth, would the justice system stand by him or bury the truth forever? If you believe that justice should always prevail, hit the like button and comment your thoughts on the boy's bravery. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss powerful stories like this. Now, let's go back to the moment when young Kalon Bryce shattered the silence. A moment that changed everything. The air inside the courtroom was thick, heavy with quiet murmurs, rustling papers, and the slow, deliberate tapping of a judge's gavel against the desk. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting long streaks of light onto the polished wooden floors. Yet, despite the warmth of the day, the room felt cold, suffocating. People filled the benches, leaning forward with intense anticipation. Journalists gripped their notepads, pens poised to document the final moments of what was believed to be an open-and-shut case. Spectators, some hungry for justice, others merely drawn to the drama, whispered among themselves. At the center of it all sat Darius Wren, a young black man barely in his 20s, shackled at the wrists, shoulders hunched under the weight of what felt like the entire legal system pressing down on him. His face was worn with exhaustion, yet his eyes held something raw, not fear, but helplessness. He had spent weeks proclaiming his innocence, but no one had listened. Today, as the prosecution prepared to deliver its final arguments, it seemed clear that no one would. Standing tall and confident, the prosecutor strode to the center of the room. His voice, crisp and unwavering, sliced through the courtroom like a knife, detailing the supposed crime. An elderly woman brutally assaulted, her savings stolen, her life forever changed. And Darius Wren, according to the prosecution, was nothing more than a desperate thug. A man with no alibi, no power, no way to fight back against the overwhelming evidence stacked against him. But the star witness today wasn't the victim. It was Sergeant Torrin Vale, a towering figure in the community. Sergeant Vale was everything the public wanted in a police officer. Strong, disciplined, and dedicated to keeping the streets safe. He had built his career on taking criminals off the streets, and today he was here to seal the fate of another. He sat with an air of quiet authority, his uniform crisp, his badge gleaming under the courtroom lights. To most, he was a hero, a symbol of justice. His testimony alone would be enough to convince the jury that Darius Wren was guilty. The defense attorney, though seasoned, looked tired and outmatched. His suit, slightly wrinkled, told the story of a man overworked and underfunded, fighting against a system that never fought for men like Darius Wren. His voice was steady, but it lacked the force, the power, that the prosecutor wielded so effortlessly. And the jury, they had already made up their minds. It was only a matter of time before the verdict was handed down. Tucked near the back of the courtroom, seated among the quiet observers, Kalon Bryce guided his tiny toy car along the wooden bench, making soft engine noises under his breath. He was 5 years old, too young to understand the weight of the moment, too innocent to recognize the storm about to unfold. His mother, Serafina Bryce, sat beside him, her fingers resting on his small shoulder as if to remind him to stay still. Unlike the others in the room, Serafina wasn't here out of a sense of justice or curiosity. She had been called as a minor witness. Her small grocery store stood just across from the alley where the crime had allegedly taken place. She hadn't seen much that night, just a few vague shapes moving in the dark, nothing concrete, or so she had thought. As the trial unfolded, as arguments were made and evidence presented, no one paid any attention to the little boy with the toy car. No one knew he had seen something no one else had. No one knew that, in just a few moments, he would change everything. The heavy courtroom doors swung open with a low creak. A group of officers stepped inside, their polished boots clicking against the hardwood floor as they took their positions along the walls. It was routine, a formality, nothing out of the ordinary, but the air in the room shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way most people noticed, but in a way that mattered. At the front of the group walked Sergeant Torrin Vale. He didn't rush, he didn't need to. He moved with the confidence of a man who had nothing to prove. His posture was impeccable, his stride deliberate, the sharp lines of his uniform pressed to perfection. The badge on his chest gleamed under the courtroom lights. The moment he entered, people noticed, not because he demanded attention, he never had to. It was simply who he was, a leader, a protector, the kind of officer the community trusted. Vale nodded briefly to the prosecutor, his expression unreadable, then took his place at the front of the room, arms folded behind his back, as if he were overseeing yet another day of justice being served. To the jury, to the audience, to everyone in that room, this was the moment that sealed Darius Wren's fate. Except it wasn't, because in the very back of the courtroom, a little boy had stopped playing. The red toy car lay forgotten on the floor, its wheels spinning idly before coming to a stop. Kalon Bryce sat frozen, his tiny fingers gripping the bench so tightly his knuckles turned white. His little chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths. His eyes, wide, round, and dark, were locked on Sergeant Vale. He didn't blink, didn't move, didn't make a sound. Serafina felt the shift before she even looked at her son. The warmth of his small body next to her had changed. He was rigid now, stiff, as if something deep inside him had snapped into place. She turned to him, concern flickering across her face. "Kalon," but the boy didn't respond. His eyes were still on Vale, his mouth parted slightly, but no words came out. Serafina's heart gave a small, uneasy twist. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Baby, what's wrong?" This time, Kalon's lips moved, barely above a breath, so soft she almost missed it. "Mama, that's him." Serafina's stomach dropped, her pulse thumping loudly in her ears. She blinked, staring at her son as if she had misheard, her voice coming out hesitant, careful, almost afraid to ask. "What do you mean?" Kalon swallowed hard, his tiny fingers clutching the fabric of her sleeve, his grip trembling. And then, in a voice so clear it sliced through the courtroom like a blade, he said, "I saw him there that night." The words hung in the air, slicing through the steady hum of the courtroom like a thunderclap. Serafina's breath caught. A ripple of confusion passed through the crowd. A few heads turned, unsure of what they had just heard. A low murmur flickered among the audience, like the first stirrings of wind before a storm. But Kalon wasn't done. Before Serafina could stop him, before she could process what was happening, he pushed himself up onto his small feet. His body wavered slightly, but his voice didn't. His small hand shot out, his finger pointing straight at Sergeant Vale. "He was there that night." The entire courtroom froze. Serafina's breath came fast, sharp. The room was dead silent, as if the walls themselves had stopped breathing. The prosecutor, mid-sentence, snapped his head toward the boy. The defense attorney, who had been jotting notes, dropped his pen. The judge, who had been flipping through a file, stilled completely. And for the first time since entering the courtroom, Darius Wren lifted his head. Every eye was now on Kalon, every single one. But Serafina wasn't looking at them. She was looking at Sergeant Vale. And what she saw made her blood run cold. Because for just one fraction of a second, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, Vale took a step back. It was small, subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A step backward, a step away. Serafina felt a chill race down her spine. For the first time that day, the untouchable Sergeant Torrin Vale looked like a man who had something to hide. And Kalon had just exposed him. For a single, breathless second, no one moved. The air inside the courtroom had weight now, thick and charged, like the sky just before a storm. The silence was deafening. Not the kind of stillness that came from order, but the kind that came from shock. Kalon's small voice still lingered in the air. "He was there that night." Every eye remained locked on him, every breath held. Then, like a dam breaking, the room erupted. Murmurs swelled into whispers. Whispers spilled into hushed exclamations. People shifted in their seats, some turning to one another in disbelief, others craning their necks for a better view of the little boy who had just spoken the words no one expected to hear. The judge, who had remained composed all morning, leaned forward ever so slightly, his gaze now sharp, assessing. A journalist in the back scribbled furiously in his notebook, glancing up every few seconds as if he couldn't believe what he was writing. Darius Wren's attorney, a man who had spent the better part of the trial fighting a losing battle, suddenly came alive. He had been drowning. Now he had found a lifeline. With controlled urgency, the lawyer shot up from his chair, his voice cutting through the rising noise. "Your Honor," he said, his tone measured, careful. "I believe we need to hear more from this young witness." It was a bold move, one that would have been dismissed under normal circumstances. But this wasn't normal anymore. The judge hesitated, just for a moment, before nodding. "Proceed." That was all the lawyer needed. He turned, his gaze locking onto Kalon and Serafina. His expression softened but his voice firm. "Kalon," he said, "can you tell us what you mean?" The boy stayed standing, his little fingers still curled into his mother's sleeve. He swallowed hard but didn't look away from Sergeant Vale, and that alone sent another ripple through the room. Vale, the man who had walked in with such certainty, such authority, was no longer the center of control. A 5-year-old was. Then came the resistance, like a machine shifting into gear. The prosecution moved fast. "Objection!" The prosecutor's voice was sharp, clipped, like he was trying to cut through the moment before it could gain momentum. "This is absurd. We're talking about a child, Your Honor, a 5-year-old. He doesn't understand what he's saying." The judge turned toward him, eyes narrowing. "Mr. Harrow, do you have reason to believe this witness is lying?" Pause just for a second, but it was there. The prosecutor exhaled through his nose, adjusting the cuffs of his perfectly pressed suit. "Not lying, Your Honor, simply mistaken. Children misremember things all the time. They get confused." Through it all, Sergeant Vale remained still, too still. His face was unreadable, a mask of controlled indifference, but his hands told a different story. Fingers that had once rested loosely, effortlessly behind his back were now curled just a little too tightly, the tendons in his wrists subtly flexing. A man like him didn't show weakness, didn't panic. But this wasn't panic, this was calculation. His mind was already moving, already rearranging, already crafting a way to regain control of the narrative before it spun too far beyond his grasp. And so, when he finally spoke, his voice was as smooth as ever. "Your Honor," he said, "this is nothing more than a misunderstanding." Slowly, deliberately, he turned toward Kalon. Not in anger, not in defense, but in carefully measured patience. "Son," Vale said, his voice gentle, almost fatherly, "I think you're confused. Maybe you saw someone else that night." It was subtle, a seed of doubt planted with precision. Not an attack, but a correction. A man like Torrin Vale didn't fight head-on, he guided, he redirected. Because that was all it would take. Just one moment of hesitation. Just 1 second where a little boy might question himself. And then, just like that, the truth would slip through his fingers before anyone could grab hold of it. The silence stretched, thick, unyielding. It wasn't just quiet. It was charged, like the air before a thunderstorm. Kalon stood, small yet unwavering, his fingers curled tightly around his mother's sleeve. His wide eyes never left Sergeant Vale, not for a second. Serafina could feel the tension in her son's body. He wasn't just remembering, he was reliving it, and deep in her gut, she knew he wasn't wrong. The defense attorney stepped forward carefully, his voice calm, measured. "Kalon," he said, "tell us what you saw." The little boy swallowed, his breath coming fast and shallow. But when he spoke, his voice was clear. "I saw him standing by the alley." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, small at first, then growing. Kalon's grip on his mother's arm tightened, his brow furrowed, frustration creeping into his tiny features. Not fear, but frustration, as if he could feel the doubt in the room, feel them questioning him even when he knew what he saw. He took a small, shaky breath and kept going. He was talking to someone. Then he got in his car and drove away. The weight of his words hung in the air, no hesitation, no second-guessing, just fact. The prosecutor let out a short, forced chuckle, shaking his head as if brushing away a child's innocent mistake. Kalon, he said, his tone carefully light. It was dark that night, wasn't it? Are you sure you saw clearly? Serafina's stomach twisted. She knew exactly what he was doing, planting doubt, making Kalon question himself. She felt her son stiffen beside her, but Kalon wasn't doubting anything. His small fingers clenched into fists, his jaw set, and then, with quiet certainty, he spoke again. He had a shiny watch, a heartbeat, then another, a shift, a crack in the room's foundation. Serafina's breath hitched. She knew that watch. Sergeant Vale always wore it, custom-made, engraved, one of a kind. The prosecutor's face remained still, but his fingers twitched against the table. The defense attorney slowly turned his gaze to Vale, and for the first time, Vale didn't look so untouchable. Serafina gripped her son's hand tighter, her pulse hammering in her ears. Because if Kalon was right, if Vale had been there, this wasn't just a wrongful conviction, it was a setup. Darius Wren was sitting in chains for a crime he didn't commit, and Sergeant Vale wasn't here to serve justice. He was here to bury the truth. Serafina felt her throat tighten. Something was coming, something big, and there was no stopping it now. Serafina sat stiffly in the cold, windowless interrogation room, her fingers locked around Kalon's tiny hand. The fluorescent light buzzed faintly above them, casting a pale glow over the scuffed metal table. The air smelled of old coffee and something else, unease. Across from them sat Assistant District Attorney Elton Marwood, his sharp eyes flickering between Serafina and her son. He wasn't aggressive, but he wasn't warm either, he was calculating. Kalon kicked his feet lightly against the chair, his fingers tracing invisible lines on the tabletop. He wasn't nervous. Serafina, however, was. She could feel it, the shift in the air, the growing weight of what Kalon had done back in that courtroom. And now they were here. Marwood exhaled through his nose, leaning forward slightly. Kalon, he said, his voice measured. Can you tell me again what you saw? Kalon blinked up at him, unfazed, his voice steady. I saw him standing by the alley. He was talking to someone. Then he got in his car and drove away. Marwood didn't react immediately. He just studied the boy, as if waiting for hesitation, waiting for Kalon to shift in his seat, to glance at his mother for reassurance, to doubt himself. But Kalon didn't. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, as if he was the one waiting. Serafina squeezed his hand, but it wasn't out of reassurance. It was out of something else, something that felt a lot like fear. Marwood nodded slowly. Then, in the same careful tone, he asked, Are you sure it was him, Kalon? Are you sure it was Sergeant Vale? Kalon's fingers curled against the table. His brow furrowed just slightly. Yes. A beat of silence. Then, for the first time, Serafina saw it. A flicker of doubt in the prosecutor's eyes. He knew. He knew something wasn't right. Marwood straightened, pushing back his chair without a word. He stepped out of the room, leaving Serafina and Kalon alone. The door clicked shut behind him. Serafina let out a slow breath, barely realizing she had been holding it. She looked down at Kalon, brushing a hand over his curls. You okay, baby? She whispered. Kalon nodded, but Serafina wasn't, because this was bigger than she had thought. The door swung open again. This time it wasn't just Marwood. A second man entered, a young investigator, his expression tight. He carried a folder in his hands, gripping it like it weighed more than just paper. He placed it on the table and opened it. Serafina felt her pulse quicken. The first image was a grainy security camera still, the timestamp placing it around the time of the attack. A black car parked near the alley, the shape of a man standing beside it. The footage was blurry, but the stance, the broad-shouldered confidence of the figure was familiar. Serafina swallowed hard. The investigator flipped the page, a second image, a different camera. This one was clearer, and there it was, the license plate. Her stomach twisted. She didn't need them to say it, the car belonged to Sergeant Vale. Serafina glanced at Kalon. He was staring at the image, his small fingers pressing into the fabric of her sleeve. He had been right all along. Marwood cleared his throat. He wasn't looking at Kalon anymore, he was looking at Serafina, his voice quieter now, lower. Mrs. Bryce. "Have you ever seen Sergeant Vale near your store before?" Serafina hesitated. A memory surfaced, a night months ago. She had been closing up late and noticed a car sitting across the street, idling. Dark, sleek, expensive. At the time, she hadn't thought much of it. Just another customer who changed their mind. But now she wasn't so sure. She wet her lips, exhaling slowly. I don't know. But Marwood wasn't done. He flipped to another page. Bank records, lines of numbers, deposits, withdrawals, money moving where it shouldn't. Serafina's pulse pounded in her ears as the investigator spoke. Vale has been receiving large payments shortly after major arrests. Her throat tightened. "They're not bribes," Marwood clarified. "Not in the traditional sense, but they're payouts." Serafina felt sick. Kalon's small voice broke the silence. "That means he did it, right?" No one spoke, because Kalon had seen the truth first, and now the evidence was catching up. Sergeant Torrin Vale sat alone in his car, his fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The dim glow of a street lamp cast long shadows across his face, but it couldn't mask the tension tightening his jaw, the pulse ticking hard at his temple. He had spent years staying ahead of the game, controlling the narrative, keeping things clean. But now things were slipping. A 5-year-old had pointed a finger at him in court. A child, and somehow that was enough to make everything unravel. Vale exhaled slowly, forcing himself to think. He had been here before, at the edge of a situation spiraling out of control. He knew what had to be done. He grabbed his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he landed on a name. He hit dial. A gruff voice answered. "Yeah, we have a problem," Vale said, keeping his voice low. "I need you to take care of it." There was a pause, a beat of hesitation. "You sure about this?" Vale's grip on the wheel tightened. "I wouldn't be calling if I wasn't." Another pause, then a slow exhale. "All right, but this one's messy." Vale's jaw clenched. He didn't need a reminder of that. Just handle it. The line went dead. Vale sat in the darkness for a long moment, staring ahead, his mind calculating the next move. If Serafina and that kid kept talking, if the prosecutor kept digging, he couldn't let that happen. Serafina woke to the sound of something shifting outside. It wasn't loud, it wasn't obvious, but it was there. She sat up, her heart hammering in her chest. The house was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of the street lamp outside. Slowly, carefully, she slid out of bed and padded toward the window. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet. She reached for the curtain, pausing for just a second, then pulled it back, and froze. A dark figure stood across the street, just beyond the glow of the street lamp. Not moving, just watching. Serafina's breath caught. Her first instinct was to tell herself she was imagining it. Maybe it was just a neighbor, maybe it was nothing. But then, a shift. The shadow moved. Not toward her, not away, just a slight adjustment. As if whoever it was had just realized they'd been seen. A sharp shiver ran down her spine. That wasn't nothing. That was someone. Then a small hand tugged at her sleeve. Serafina nearly jumped. She turned and saw Kalon standing in the doorway, rubbing his eyes with tiny fists, his voice small, barely above a whisper. "Mama, there's someone outside." Serafina felt something cold settle deep in her stomach. Her hands moved before her mind could catch up, grabbing her phone off the nightstand. She tapped the screen, her fingers trembling slightly as she scrolled for a number. Her lawyer. She hit call. The line rang once, twice, then a groggy voice answered. "Serafina, what's wrong?" She didn't hesitate. "We're being watched." Serafina turned back to the window, but the shadow was gone. A chill ran through her. She didn't know how long they had been standing there. She didn't know who else might be watching. But she knew one thing. This wasn't just about corruption anymore. Sergeant Vale wasn't just a dirty cop trying to cover his tracks. He was a desperate man, and desperate men were dangerous. Serafina's hands moved on their own, shoving clothes into a duffel bag, grabbing Kalon's backpack, stuffing in whatever she could. Her heart pounded against her ribs, but she forced herself to think, to move, to get out. She didn't bother turning on the lights, There was no time. She needed to be gone before they came back. Kalon stood near the door, wide-eyed, gripping his toy car like a lifeline. "Mama, where are we going?" Serafina zipped the bag shut. "Somewhere safe, baby. Get your shoes on." She didn't tell him the truth, that she didn't know where they were going, that all she knew was they couldn't stay here. She threw the bag into the passenger seat, pulled Kalon into his car seat, and started the engine. The moment the tires hit the road, she forced herself not to look back. But the fear, it sat heavy in the pit of her stomach. And then it got worse, because the moment she hit the highway, she saw it, a black car, following them. Serafina gripped the wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She knew that car. She knew who was inside. Sergeant Vale wasn't just watching anymore, he was coming for them. Serafina's breath came fast, her pulse roaring in her ears. She glanced in the rearview mirror. Vale's headlights were steady, unblinking, hunting her. Kalon's voice was small, unsure. "Mama!" She forced herself to sound calm. "It's okay, baby. Just hold on." But it wasn't okay, not even close. Because Vale wasn't just following anymore, he was speeding up. Serafina's foot pressed harder on the gas. The dark road stretched ahead, endless, empty. There were no other cars, no exits, nowhere to turn. Vale's car moved closer. Serafina's breath hitched. No, no, no. Then the sudden jolt of impact. Vale's car slammed into her rear bumper. Kalon let out a cry, his little hands clutching his seat belt. Serafina gritted her teeth, fighting for control, her tires screeching as she swerved back into her lane. Her hands shook on the wheel. Vale wasn't trying to scare her, he was trying to run her off the road. Her eyes darted around, but there was nothing. No exits, no police, no help. She was alone. Just her, Kalon, and a man who couldn't afford to let them live. Vale hit her again, harder. The car skidded. Kalon screamed. Serafina fought the wheel, her breath coming in sharp gasps. She needed to do something. She needed red and blue lights, flashing bright, coming fast. Serafina's eyes flicked to the mirror, a second car, a squad car. Her heart leapt. The sirens wailed, cutting through the night like a blade. Vale must have seen it too, because his car suddenly swerved away, trying to escape. But it was too late. The police cruiser cut across the road, blocking his path. Tires screeched. The black car spun out, skidding sideways, metal grinding against pavement. Then silence. Serafina's hands were still locked on the wheel, her entire body frozen. The officer stepped out of his car, gun drawn. Torin Vale stepped out of the vehicle, hands up. For a moment Vale didn't move. Then the door opened. Vale emerged slowly, his face unreadable but his hands raised. He knew it was over. Serafina let out a shaking breath, her grip finally loosening. Kalon whimpered. Serafina reached back, running a hand over his curls. "It's okay, baby. It's over." But even as she said it, even as she watched Vale being forced to the ground, cuffs snapping around his wrists, she knew the truth. This wasn't just about one dirty cop. This was bigger, and she had no idea how deep it really went. The courtroom was packed. Every seat filled. Every eye locked on the judge as he prepared to deliver his final words. Darius Wren sat at the defense table, his hands gripping the edge, his breath held tight in his chest. He had barely spoken during the trial, had barely lifted his head, because what was the point of hoping when the system had already decided your fate? But now something felt different. Serafina sat behind him, Kalon on her lap, his tiny fingers clutching her hand. They had done all they could. The truth had been exposed, and yet the room was still heavy. The court finds the defendant not guilty. For a second, no one moved, no one breathed. Then Darius let out a sharp, broken gasp, like a man surfacing for air after being trapped underwater for too long. His lawyer grabbed his shoulder, whispering something, but Darius barely heard him. Because for the first time in weeks, in years, he was free. Kalon turned to his mother, eyes wide. "He gets to go home now?" Serafina smiled through the sting of tears. "Yes, baby, he does." But this wasn't just about one man's freedom. because one truth had led to another, and now the whole system was under a microscope. The headlines exploded. Corrupt officer exposed. How many more victims? Who else did Vale set up? Investigators dug deeper. Cases Vale had worked on were reopened. Evidence that had conveniently disappeared started to resurface. And the city, it wasn't just watching. It was demanding answers. For the first time in a long time, people weren't just accepting what they were told. They were asking why. And Serafina Bryce made sure they didn't stop. The television cameras flickered on. The lights were bright, too bright. But Serafina sat tall, her hands steady in her lap. Across from her, the reporter adjusted her mic, then leaned in. Serafina, what made you decide to come forward? Serafina let out a slow breath. She had thought about this moment for days, about the weight of the truth, about the risk. She looked directly at the camera. Because we're tired of being afraid. The studio went silent. The world listened. Serafina's voice didn't waver. People like Sergeant Vale, they don't just exist in the shadows. They exist in our communities. We shake their hands, we call them sir. We trust them. But sometimes, they are the ones we should fear the most. The reporter shifted. Do you think this was just one bad officer? Serafina's lips pressed together. Then she shook her head. No. And that's the problem. Because if Vale had been willing to frame an innocent man, if he had been willing to chase down a mother and her child in the dead of night, what else had he done? And how many others had helped him do it? Serafina wasn't here to be a victim. She was here to make sure no one else had to be. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters, their cameras flashing, their voices overlapping in a chaotic blur. But Serafina barely heard them. She held Kalon's hand, keeping him close as they walked through the sea of questions and microphones. The little boy didn't seem scared. If anything, he looked curious. Kalon glanced up at his mother. Did we stop the bad guy? Serafina squeezed his hand. We stopped one. He thought about that for a second, then looked ahead. Are there more? Serafina's throat tightened. She didn't have to answer. Kalon was smart. He already knew. Instead, she crouched down, brushing his curls away from his face. You were so brave, baby, she whispered. You told the truth when no one else would. Kalon's small chest puffed up just a little. He wasn't just a little boy anymore. He was the child who had spoken up, the child who had pointed at power and refused to back down. And now the world knew his name. He was a symbol of something bigger, something unstoppable. As they walked toward the waiting car, Kalon's fingers slipped from his mother's and stretched out toward the sky. The sun was just beginning to rise, spilling golden light across the pavement. He smiled. Serafina looked at him, then up at the sky. A new day, a new fight. Because justice was just getting started. If the story moved you, hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Justice isn't just about one case. It's about standing up, speaking out, and making sure the truth is never silenced. Your support means everything. It helps us continue creating powerful stories that shed light on real issues and inspire change. So, if you believe in the power of truth, subscribe to the channel and stay with us for more stories that matter. Together, we can keep the conversation going. Thank you for watching.